morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We have Mark Blanke with OwlPoint today. And Mark, we're 2 minutes in, so I'm gonna let you talk about how fabulous you are and what you're gonna talk about today. And we can see your screen. Thank you, sir.
Perfect. That's what I wanted to make sure you knew. So thank you very much for the introduction. So I'll introduce myself a little bit. Make sure we can move forward here. Hold on. There we go. So I'm Mark Blanke. I lead a consulting organization called OwlPoint. We focus mainly on helping organizations really manage IT, and obviously IT service management is core to who we are. We've leveraged that for our entire existence. We've been in business for about 10 years, and we are an Axelos certified consulting partner. But what I want to talk to you today was really, how do you get on that journey, and how do you make that journey successful to going to ITIL Island? And so through our history, we've definitely helped a lot of different companies through that path. We wanted to share some of the successes we've had and the steps that people have taken to get there.
And Mark, so I'm also going to, yep. I'm sorry, I've just thrown up the first poll.
Perfect. So yeah, people,
exactly.
Everybody can take a look at that poll question and answer that. We'll review that in a second. But I also want to talk a little bit more about, what is that journey to ITIL Island? And we're going to go through the steps that you can take to be successful. And I'm also going to talk about, different versions of ITIL. Obviously, there's a lot of questions, concerns, excitement around ITIL 4. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those principles are and how that may apply to your journey. Definitely some things you can use today, no matter what version you're on. And I know there's organizations out there that are very established in ITIL v3, may not have any interest in moving to 4 at this point. And this still will apply to you. So this will apply to all versions. And let's see how we're doing with that polling question.
We're about 72% voted. So I'm gonna go ahead and give everybody just one more beat. And I'm gonna close down the poll. And so here's what we've got. 67% of the folks have started reading and learning. 13% are talking about mapping their existing ITSM programs. So boy, you guys are at the right place, right time today. And then a two-way tie at 10%. There's an ITIL 4 and other. And if you did say other, please go ahead and chat that in if you'd like to, and we'll share that with Mark throughout. And I'm going to close that poll. And it's back to your screen, sir.
Okay, great. So we'll get started on how to create your map to ITIL Island. So we want to start that journey. The first place, first thing you got to think about when you're starting any journey is, where are we going? We want to go. So actually, first is really, we want to go somewhere. We want to get on a journey, and why. And then you got to figure out exactly where you want it to take you. Then you figure out where your starting point is, right? Figure out where we are today. We apply your course, and we take your journey. So very much in an ITIL perspective, what are the capabilities we want? How do we get there? Where are we today? Map that course out with the difference, and then establish your journey. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about ITIL 4 and set up some things that I'll apply throughout the webinar today. Really talking about the ITIL 4 guiding principles. And I think this is something that you can apply to any service management program, whether or not you're going to move to the ITIL 4 guidance or not. I still think these guiding principles can apply to anything. The actual guiding principles for ITIL were introduced in the recent ITIL practitioner a couple of years ago. There was actually 9 principles. They've simplified it some in ITIL 4. Now we have the 7. The focus on value. Really that's in a sense why we're doing this, right? When we talk about where are we going, why are we doing service management, that focus on value is extremely important and very much a core concept of value co-creation in ITIL 4. Then the other guiding principle is starting where you are, right? So we're going to talk about that. Where are we today, and how do we get to our destination? Very fundamentally, start where you are. Then there's obviously integrations with other practices such as Agile and DevOps and stuff. So that concept of progress iteratively with feedback comes from there. So collaborate and promote visibility, think and work holistically, and keep it simple and practical. Those are steps and guiding principles that you very much can apply to when we move on our journey, how we do it, and then really at the end we can look at how we've done and optimize and automate and make our program even better. All right. Let's also look a little bit more about ITIL 4. If you start reading the books on, the ITIL foundations or take the courses, you're going to see these concepts of ITIL service value system and the ITIL service value chain. And as I mentioned previously, value is a core concept and a core meaning to the whole ITIL 4. So we do things as an IT organization or even other organizations, right, that can apply service management practices. We have to apply that value, and that value is co-created. That's another concept that's talked a lot about in ITIL 4. It's a co-creation of value. That's a shared value creation between the customer and the service providers. And I think in the past, we've looked very much about the service provider trying to create that value, and that hopefully that the business recognizes it. But really, we should be working together to identify what's valuable for our business and making sure that the IT components or the other service management organizations support an extension of that value chain, that they're in support of overall value for the business. I think from a service value system, you'll see the guiding principles there, governance, which is an extremely important component. I don't think we talk enough about that in service management as a separate piece, but we always should have it there. A lot of people have been doing this for a while, know that you set the governance in, you set your policies, et cetera. That's important. And the practices. We've moved away from really process as an independent component in ITIL 4, and we now call it practices, which is really the people, process, platforms, the 4 Ps that we talk about: people, process, and technologies, and our partners. And then you've got continual improvement here. The service value chain, and I got to be honest, when I first looked at V4, and I'm coming from a V3, 2011 perspective, and I just look at this, I don't understand it. Like, it didn't connect with me immediately. I said, I don't know how I map version 3 to version 4. It just didn't, connect. I wasn't able to just line up the dots and say, okay, it makes sense. When I moved from V2 to V3, it was obvious to me. It was a little bit different of a wrapper, but there's a lot of the same components. It's just organized differently. And I think when you look at version 4, it takes a little while to start to understand it, and it's a slightly different concept and approach. It's not as sequential as you saw in version 3 and 2011 with the life cycle. Now it's more of pulling in the pieces that you need when you need them. And it makes sense after a while, but to me it did not hit immediately. It took me a little bit to understand these concepts. So with that, we'll start our journey here. So first, we got to have a desire to go somewhere, right? So what are we fundamentally trying to solve? Right? Why are we trying to create this journey to go to ITIL Island? What is it about ITIL that we actually want to apply? And another question we probably have to ask is, do people really want to change? The answer is no. People, I think, like the concept of change, but then when it actually comes time to change, there's always a lot of reluctance. So we always have to make that into our whole adoption challenge of moving people from point A to point B. But some examples of what we might have for going somewhere. I think some people on this webinar may be interested in, how do I just establish an IT service management program for the first time? I think there's probably folks that want to enhance or change their perspective, maybe moving from 3 to 4. We also may be in those standard challenges of service management, of how do we improve our service desks, or how do we reduce risk in our organization. And so that might be some reasons we're moving forward.
Mark, that sounds like it's a great time to throw up your second polling question. Is it okay if I do that?
Sure, let's do that.
Okay. And you know what Chantel Smith says about change. Change is great. You go first.
Exactly.
Guys, I've thrown up the polling question. If you could please chime in for us, it really helps, Mark.
I think that is a challenge, right? So we have we get people excited about change. I think, a lot of us in technology obviously like change. We like the new tools, we like, toys, etc. But when it really comes down to making the change, it's a challenge. Hey, I got my, new version of my software on my iPhone, or my new iPhone, and I'm starting to get frustrated because it doesn't work the same way it used to. So I'm just getting old, because then I ask my son, how do I do certain things, and he's he's explaining that to me and rolling his eyes at me and saying, "Aren't you a technologist? Why are you having trouble with this?"
Exactly. All right, we've got about 70% voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close that down. And here are your results, Mark. 43%, that's awesome. Have a defined program. Oh, but the value is not understood by the business. Maybe I'll take that off. We've got 36% at a somewhat defined, 11% defined and interactive and valued, and then 7% at informal and 4% at other. And if you did other and you want to chat in, please feel free. Okay, Mark.
So it sounds like a majority of our attendees here don't have that well-defined or fine-tuned service management program, which is, I think, very typical. So obviously, there's definitely places to go on the journey. So we just have to define exactly what those are for everybody. So I think one of the first steps, once we've figured out we want to go somewhere, is we need to create the desire in the groups to move forward, right? Why are we going on this journey? Let's get excited. Let's get people understanding exactly why we're doing something. I think one area is to find common frustration. So we don't want to lead with negativity, but we do want to find out, what would make people's lives better. So if you can get people to kind of understand that, hey, I'm tired of, if they're working on the service desk, I'm tired of being yelled at and not having good answers for people, or, we're never meeting service levels properly, or, why is it always our fault that something's happening? There very much may be, hey, it could be better for us. So here's some ways we can improve our programs, improve our in a sense, perception. And I think that's another issue a lot of times we have is sometimes things aren't that bad, but there may be a bad reputation. That reputation may have been earned years ago, but for some reason, that perception has not disappeared. And so we need to have a better way of really demonstrating value, demonstrating capabilities. Two, when we move on this journey, as I just mentioned before, you're going to ask people to make a change. And people are going to be reluctant to change unless they understand that there is something better, that their lives are going to be better, and that the actual pain to change is less than the pain to stay the same, right? So otherwise, people are just going to stay in their spot. Also, get people involved. This is very important to start to listen to folks, listen to customers, listen to users, listen to coworkers, to understand, exactly where do we want to go and why. And if you listen to people and you listen to their ideas, they have a much better chance of actually, following it. They like to follow their own ideas. All right, and then also be a leader. And I think there's very much difference between managing things and leading things. If you lead people, you're a leader. You get people naturally follow you to get to somewhere. And I think part of that is create a good journey, a good destination, and get some excitement around it. So we still need to kind of set our target of where we're going. Why are we getting there? Then we're going to end up having to build out our course. I think one of the things we'll reference back to the ITIL 4 guiding principle, which is focus on value. Let's make sure that we understand that the things that we're doing have true demonstratable value, that the outcomes are clearly understood, that the business, the customers, the sponsors are going to understand that this has a positive impact for them. And that's something truly to remember too, if even from an IT organization, HR organizations, finance organizations, they all are supposed to provide a value to the business, and the business needs to really understand that. And they'll make the investments if they understand the value proposition. So in some cases for your setting a target, we might be setting up our program or a more formalized program for the first time. We also might be leveraging continual service improvement, analyzing our current environment and identifying areas that we can improve. And just one note from a version 3 to a version 4, it's now called continual improvement. We've dropped out the service piece. And that's another, I think, reference to the fact that improvement is across the board. It's not just around services, it's not just around a specific process, but it does apply to all the activities and practices. So also setting a target, it's very important to understand exactly where we're going. I think if you told me, hey, go west, young man, If we were starting in, let's say, the New York area or New Jersey where I'm at, and two people got in their cars and we said, we're going west, and one got on Route 80 and started going west, and I decided to go take more southern route, I might end up in San Diego. The other person might end up in Seattle. And we will be worlds apart in a sense. So it's key to understand that those targets and having people move forward together is important. At first, it may seem that everybody's on the same track, everybody sees things the same way. Those first few roads are typically very similar. But the farther you get along in a program, the farther along you get on these individual projects and targets, the farther away you might be. So it's very important to make sure that everybody's on the same track with the same destination. So I'll tell you a story about, something about where we are. So it's very important to not just understand, where we're going, but what's our starting point. And years ago, my son was very young. He's about a year old. And I have a lot of family in England. So we decided to fly over to England and, obviously show off my kids to my grandparents. And so we get on the plane. We've got our red eye. We land in Birmingham, England, early in the morning, and I'm going to rent a car and drive in England for the first time. Now, I've been to England several times. I've avoided driving. I didn't want to worry about driving on the left side, going around a roundabout in the opposite direction. There he was. We got my son all strapped up, and I'm tired. I'm hungry. My wife's a little cranky. We didn't sleep on the plane. My son's happy as could be because he slept the entire time. So he's awake. He's in the back seat of the car, strapped in, and we go on our journey. And we're basically in downtown Birmingham, England, early in the morning, and I get into this traffic circle, into the roundabout, and I start going around, and I ask my wife, where are we going? Which exit? And she says, I don't know. So I go around a second time in the circle, and I'm about 3 or 4 times around the circle now, yelling at my wife, where are we going? And she keeps pointing, to the map where our destination was. I said, yeah, but I don't know where I am. Where are we? Which part of this map do we make a decision to turn? And so we had it was a 5-point intersection. So I literally had to pull off, park in a parking lot, or car park as they'd call it, and find out exactly where we were. And then we're able to get back into that traffic circle, only go one time around and find our appropriate exit and make it to our destination. So incredibly important to understand what your starting points are so that you know what the rest of your journey is like. So I'll give you some ideas of how to figure out where you are. Sometimes this can be a pretty challenging part of their journey to be reflective and understand exactly where the organization is. First, really look at the people in the organization and find out from the group, what are we thinking? Do we have the right perspective? Are we thinking about customers? Are we thinking about value? Does everybody in the organization understand what those value propositions are for the organization? Do we already think of things in terms of services, or is that going to be part of our journey as well? And what's it like culturally? Is it positive? Are there challenges in the organization that you're constantly dealing with? So all these things really need to be taken into consideration, taken inventory. From a change management philosophy, you can really look at your organization and determine what the level of change that the organization can accept. So you can look at it historically and say, all right, how much change has the organization accepted when we've done other programs? Are they relatively adapt, or is this going to be a long journey? Obviously, the larger the organization, the harder it is to make more rapid changes. Also, is there a natural resistance? Are there a lot of people in the organization who resist change and will put up the walls? And so we can look at that again from a habits perspective. What do people tend to do? Are there clear rewards set up in the organization so that it rewards a positive change, and so on and so forth. I think in one case, when you're looking at the people side, I really call this the therapy sessions. This is an opportunity to kind of sit down and let people just naturally vent a bit. Just tell them, let them tell you how they think the organization is, or what their challenges are, or what we should be doing. Get some of those ideas. So really get it away from technology. Think of it a little bit more in psychological terms, and just let people talk. The other part too is if you're a leader in the organization, and leading something like this, don't get upset. I think it's tendencies to hope that we were farther along in a program or that we were better than we actually are. But accept where you are and then establish the rest of your journey. That's looking more on the people side. If we move forward and look at some of the other areas, we'll talk about governance and processes and practice evaluations. And I'm using the term process and practice there on purpose. So again, in ITIL 4, one of the things that's different, right, is that we don't identify processes. We identify things as practices. And practices are that culmination of the people, the technology, the processes, and your vendors, your partners. But if we look at those capabilities, what do we already have in place? Do we have well-defined processes? Are roles and responsibilities well understood? Are we measuring things? Are we reporting on things? And you can very much do a self-assessment. Axelos has the self-assessment available to them, or you can engage with an Axelos consulting partner who can do a full process assessment. But I jumped ahead a little bit. I skipped the governance. I think governance is extremely important. What governance is in place? Is there oversight of an ITSM program? Or is there an ITIL or IT Service Management governance group? Are the processes formalized, measured, reported on? Do we understand what priorities are? And do we have any sort of continual improvement programs in place? The other thing too is we're obviously going to look at their technology, what's in place today, what tools are you using? I think one of the things we tend to do, especially in technology, is we jump to the tools. Right? We look at tools first. We look at tools as a solution first, which isn't always the best way. And I think if you've got a lot of ITIL practitioners on this call and process people, us process folks are always screaming, hey, let's work on the process first. But it's all a coordinated solution, right? The people, process, and the tools together. Around the technology, one of the things that I see as the biggest challenge too is that we have different technologies doing different pieces. So whether or not we've got a tool in place that does change, we've got a different tool in place that does incident and problem management, we might have different tools in place that do service level management, whatever it might be. But if it works, great. But there needs to be a clear architecture. You have to understand exactly what tools are being used for what purpose. Does it make sense? Truly understand what their scope is, figure out how things are integrated, and make sure that there's really kind of a way to manage that architecture moving forward. From a partner's perspective, I think more and more we're outsourcing different components. We're using software as a service. So we really got to take a look at who are we working with to help build our services and provide value to our customers. And are the partners themselves properly providing us value? Are we working with them? Do we have people that we work with well? Are there certain relationships that we can manage effectively? Are all of our partners managed in that sense? We have a good engagement and can manage relationships and get the most out of a partner's value. All right, so now we've got to go plot our course. We've got to go figure out how to get from point A to point B. So we know where we are. We've kind of done an inventory of where we're at, and now we're looking at how do we get from point A to point B. This is very much when you might do a gap analysis and say, okay, here's how we get there. And obviously, the fastest and most efficient way to get from point A to point B is usually that straight line. But I think as most of us know, there's definitely could be some hurdles, some challenges in an organization. There could be some organizational issues. There could be some technical debt or some other restrictions that may not make things as easy as we would like them to be. So it's good to understand what those might be and how to work around things. We should be looking at the big picture. And again, I'll refer back to some guiding principles here. One is keep it simple and practical. Right, so our solutions should be simple and should demonstrate value quickly. And two is we should progress iteratively with feedback. So we should be looking at a program that we know that we can take certain steps and that they be achievable, that we can check our progress, adjust things accordingly, and keep on our journey. We also really have to map things out, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide or from a roadmap, but we're going to have to look to see what type of details we're going to need. I'll call that from a driving directions perspective. It may be pretty easy to say, okay, look at that big map of the United States and say, oh, I'm going to hop on Route 80 to get from the New York area to to Seattle, but I still might need to know the local roads to get my program started, or certain areas I may need to take a detour or take a stop somewhere. So it's good to understand what all the different details are. So there's definitely a devil in the details in this type of program, understanding the details around a practice, the process, the technologies, those issues. All right. So really next is really define that roadmap. So, extending from plotting our course, we really should be labeling out the details, the steps that we're going to take, whether or not it's improvements to processes specifically, how we might need to adjust using different tools. Is it going to affect the organization at all, and whether or not we need to adjust roles and responsibilities. So we really need to look at that and understand how are our practices going to be adjusted. Again, I'm going to use that term practices from ITIL 4, is think of things in that grouping of people, process, tools, and our partners, and how are all these things that we're looking to adjust going to affect each other. So let's take inventory of those process enhancements, let's take inventory of our tool changes, take inventory of what we're going to need to do from an organization perspective. And then it's also extremely important to look at the adoption activities. And I can tell you, I think this is an area that we don't spend enough time and focus on. I led a CIO roundtable discussion a couple of years ago, and the topic came up of how do we really deal with things, organizational change, and roll out programs like this, and what are some of the things that we can do to be successful. We had a detailed conversation about that kind of post-project support. A lot of times we put things into projects, we get our tools enhanced. We make adjustments to the processes, etc. But then we say we're done. Right? The tool got implemented. We identified all the roles, and the process documentation is complete. The project's over. The reality is, we've got a long journey still to go. Once those components are done, we still got to get people trained up. We still got to continue to communicate this and support this ongoing. So I think one of the things that the CIOs were saying is this is an area that get cut out of budgets very easy. So the business is really quick to cut training, or very quick to shut down post-project support. But if you think about it, if we're trying to change behaviors and we're trying to make sure that people actually follow the processes and use the new tools and really understand it, that they they need the support, they need the encouragement, they need to be monitored, and then make sure that we're making those changes in behavior. So something to make sure that we fight for, to keep budgets for in that area, even if we have to reduce some of our tool implementations or process enhancements. All right, so when we start taking our journey, I would say that one of the recommendations I would have for everybody is to really set up governance first. If you don't have a formalized service management program governance, you really should establish one, and understand how are you going to lead this? Who's going to be making sure that the processes and the practices are doing what they need to do? How are we actually going to collect metrics and report against the processes, and really set up a cadence of review of our whole project and program plans, and obviously be the group that helps set up those adjustments and priorities, and modify our program plans if necessary. One of the things I think is also important is, I talk about establishing metrics and reporting. We all have good intentions to make improvements. One of the things that I find too, though, is not every improvement is a positive effect. I actually teach a course, talk about advanced MIS, and in that class I do talk a lot about process improvement, and we do an exercise called the paper airplane exercise, where we have two groups of students who have to follow a specific process for creating paper airplanes. And they have to fold them a certain way, and we time all the different steps. We time how long it starts, we time the different steps that it takes, and we time the amount it takes to complete in this production line one entire airplane. So the students will go through and spend calculating making 20 complete airplanes, and then we'll analyze what the average time it takes to take an airplane, what the quality was like, etc. Then the students will have an opportunity to reevaluate their process, make adjustments. There's some rules around what they can adjust, but more or less they can adjust their assembly line to come up with a more effective way, a more efficient way to make the paper airplanes and maintain the same level of quality. So we then go through the same exercise again and measure the time it takes. And then I have these groups evaluate the time. And it's almost always that I get a group whose second set of numbers, the new metrics on the new and improved, or so-called new and improved process, where the timing is longer, right? It's less efficient. So it was really important to make sure that we do establish those metrics, we measure things, we measure our improvement, and ensure that those positive improvements truly did have positive value. And a lot of times, maybe something doesn't work as well as we thought it would, and we need to go back and revisit it. So don't just blindly say, okay, we're going to measure, we're just going to be better. All right, so we move forward, talking about practices. Again, that kind of transition from ITIL 4 from the previous versions. Actually, in ITIL 2011, just as an anecdote here, there were 26 processes and 4 functions. But in ITIL 4, there are 34 practices. So there's not a breakdown between process and function, and there's a lot of overlap. So something like service desk, which would be seen as a function, is now considered a practice in ITIL 4. So working on improving your practices, we have to recognize we obviously can't get everything done at once. We need to make sure that we do things iteratively. So again, taking that ITIL 4 guiding principle, progress iteratively with feedback, to make sure we break this down into sizable chunks that we can actually handle. And as I say, although I know nobody who eats elephants, they say, how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. So this is definitely one of those cases where, a program, especially if it's more significant, you're gonna have a lot of different components to work on, multiple processes to improve, tool improvements, etc. You need to break that down into areas that are manageable. You also need to make sure that you're improving things in an appropriate sequence. So different practices and processes have dependencies on other practices, right? So if we were maybe enhancing configuration management, definitely going to have a reliance on a certain level of maturity around change management. We may also have very much a dependence that the tool be configured a certain way, or we have certain definitions defined. So those sequence of events have to occur in a certain order. And I also would recommend that I see, a lot of people do this, which is just jump right into the tool implementation, or have a belief that, the tool gives me my process. Very much, a lot of the tool vendors today have good products and very much match up with ITIL best practices, but there's still a lot of definitions for an organization that are required to configure those tools properly so that you do get exactly what you want out of it. And I can tell you as a consultant, a lot of our business is driven from people who have jumped into a tool too quickly, aren't getting the value and expectations out of it, and now we're looking at their program to try to figure out how to get there. All right. Lisa, how are we doing on time?
We are doing very well. It is 11:35, and you guys in the question tab, feel free to start throwing in questions for us. We've got some kind of preloaded from the registration process, but Mark is ready, willing, and able to answer our questions.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I would love to answer some questions. I want to make sure we're going to leave some time here too, so we can address those and be a little more interactive. And I have looked at some of the questions from the registrations, and I'll address a couple of those in a minute. Actually, one I thought was a great question that's going to address a lot of this slide. So I'm going to talk about this slide and then answer that one. But people are the key to success. It doesn't matter what tools we put in place and what processes we document and what roles and organizational structure we put in place if people don't follow them. Right. So we have to recognize that change is a challenge for people in general. And we've got to recognize that a change in habits requires a lot of energy. And there's really a concept here from psychology perspective is our brains automatically create efficiencies. So that's what habits are, right? It's our brain's ability to automate certain things. We optimize it and we automate it. So if you go in and you order your coffee every day, you go into Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks or wherever, and you order the same thing, you probably don't even think about it, right? You just go up, the words come out of your mouth, and you pay and you collect. You brush your teeth in the morning. You probably don't think about it. You're not worrying about every single tooth and stuff. You probably have a routine that you follow, and your brain has automated that. And what happens is it requires a lot less decision making. Your brain doesn't have to think about everything. And there's something called decision fatigue. And that's really, every time your brain has to really calculate something, it requires some energy. So, we create habits to reduce the amount of energy that our brain has to use. And this occurs at work. We create work habits, and that's what really work behaviors are. It's these habits. So whether or not we're entering a ticket into a system a certain way, we handle meetings a certain way, there's definitely habits, and we're doing it from an efficiency perspective. So understand if you're making changes to people's kind of daily routines, that you're changing their habits. And so there's probably a limit of how much change people can handle at once, because it's exhausting. Also understand that it takes a while for these new changes to become habits. So you really need to work with folks over a period of time, and not just expect that after a training session and one day of practical usage that all of a sudden people are going to follow the practices. Give people time, encourage them to move forward, right? They're going to be reluctant. They're going to go home exhausted those days. Probably the first week or two are going to be tough. And it's too easy to just jump back into old habits, especially if you're doing something slightly different than what you're doing before. Sometimes it's easier to learn a whole new job than it is to just learn a task slightly differently. You can reinforce these behaviors by going on with a buddy system and having people, support each other and encouraging people to move forward positively. And it's also extremely important to start to measure things, give people targets and goals, be very positive about it, and show how people have demonstrated progress towards those goals. And I'll reiterate it, don't give up too quickly. I see people give up on their programs. I see people give up on projects and think things are a failure because people haven't adopted yet. But that adoption period takes a while, and let people develop those habits. Sometimes it takes up to 2 months. And so one of the questions I saw in the registration was, how do we make culture change? And the reality is, there's nothing you can do specifically that just changes culture, right? Culture happens based on people's behavior. I think the saying is, culture is what happens when the boss leaves the room. Obviously, a leader of an organization, I think I cringe when I hear that, but it is a reality. You kind of set up what the behaviors are in an organization, and that is the culture. So the first step in changing culture is to start to change behavior and understand what are those negative behaviors or what are those poor performing behaviors that we want to adjust that would create a more positive culture. I also think too, I was working with a client very recently, and we were working on change management improvements. We're talking about that one of those obvious things in change management. How do we avoid having all these emergency changes? And obviously, one way is to make sure that we're properly recognizing them and that we report against that, and we can react to the number of emergency changes. But the one thing we were actually talking about was more the cultural impact if we react too strongly. Like if we're just going to go out there and start to yell at people for submitting an emergency change, there might be that reluctance to submit them in the future, and there might be a very good reason why a change needs to happen today versus happen 5 days from now. And it might have disastrous consequences if not being addressed appropriately. But if we create a culture of don't submit an emergency change, you're going to get yelled at, or you're going to get punished, or your paycheck's going to get hurt from your bonus at the end of the year, then obviously that's not the right behaviors that we're trying to create. So be careful on how you react to metrics and the type of behavior that you're creating, and that will affect culture overall. All right, so I'm really going to summarize what we've done so far on this webinar. We've talked about how do we create our map to ITIL Island. First things first, decide that you want to go somewhere. So where is ITIL Island for you? And identify what that is. And really, next step, establish where that journey should take you. So what do you expect at your destination? Are we looking for beaches and sunshine? Are we looking to go to the mountains and the forest? We should really have a clear understanding of what we expect to get out of our destination. And then where are we starting from, right? So figure out where you are today. figure out that starting point, and also kind of measure how far is ITIL Island for us at this point. Then we need to plot the course, so get the directions. We might need to know some local roads, so we're going to need some expertise in different areas. That's practices or tool sets or organizational change management, things like that. And then once we're ready, we start to take your journey. So we're going to pack your stuff, you're going to buy your boat tickets, and we're going to set sail for ITIL Island. And really, to summarize here, your ITIL adventure is never over. This is always a continual thing, right? ITIL is not a project. It is a capability. It is a way we provide value to the business. And so we should always be thinking about kind of what's our next adventure and what's our next destination. So I'll say it's time for us to go to ITIL Nation, right? That's our next big thing. We can leverage things like continual improvement to do a self-evaluation and start our next journey. And we'll also, another kind of ITIL 4 guiding principle that we can leverage here is optimize and automate, to start to look to see what we have, make things better, and then automate what we can.